Okay guys, so I'm going to walk you through how to do the tool tote. This won't be a completely exhaustive explanation of Rhino, but hopefully by actually making a drawing of something that you're going to build, it will land a little bit easier. So the first thing I'm going to start off with is I'm going to make sure I'm in the default layer, and I'm going to make a rectangle just to sort of encompass, just like we did with the orthographic drawings, encompass like the furthest extents of the geometry. So I'm going to start at the origin, so I'm going to say 0, 0 for the first corner of the rectangle. And then for the next corner, it's going to try to first land the x-axis number and then the y-axis measurement. So if I type 20, it will go to my 20 inches out on the x-axis, and then if I type 10, it will go to 10 inches up on the y-axis. And these dimensions are somewhat arbitrary. We left them open so that you guys would have a chance to really customize your tool totes for your own uses. So I'm kind of making them up as I'm going along. So I have a rectangle now that's symbolizing the full extent of my tool tote here from the front. So first thing I can do now is do my side panel. So I can snap onto that end point there. And I want it 20 inches long and 6 inches wide. And the reason why I'm picking 6 inches is because I will actually have some cross grain with this tool tote, and 6 inches, I would say really 4 inches, but 6 inches I would say is the absolute maximum that you could have one grain going in one direction and another grain going in the other direction before you start to see a lot of splitting in the wood. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is draw the handle. So I know that's going to start from the top. I went into my polyline, so I'll click rectangle. And again, I'm going to want it 20 inches long. And because I'm coming from the top, the y-axis measurement is actually going to be a negative number rather than a positive one. So I'm going to say negative 2.5. Okay, so I have these two rectangles placed now. And then because this handle looks quite heavy, I will probably make an arc that I will shape into it so it looks a little bit less heavy. So first thing I'm going to do is kind of sketch out where my side panels are going to be, so that way I know that I have a little bit of a straight to accommodate for joinery. So I'm imagining my side panels are only going to be about 1/2 inch wide. So I could even turn my grid snap on here, and I know that since each part of the grid is 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch is going to be 2 sections of the grid. And then I could do the same thing to create the side line on the other half, or I can save myself a little bit of work and use the mirror command. So my command bar is always going to prompt me on what to do next. So it says select objects to mirror. I'm going to select this line and hit enter. And then it says start of mirror plane. So the mirror plane is basically what the line will be flipped over. So I'm going to be using my midpoint so that way my mirror plane is centered. And then I'm going to hit shift to go into ortho and click. So now I have my two side pieces kind of indicated. I definitely want a good portion of my reference face kept for when I make this curve, so that way I know for sure I'm not risking carving into my joinery. And then to make a curve, there's kind of any number of ways to approach it. If I go into my curves here, you can see I can do an arc, and an arc basically means it's a section of a circle, so it has a consistent radius. I can do an ellipse, parabola where the radius is exponentially increasing or decreasing, spiral, helix. If I go into my different polyline options, actually I can't remember their names that well, so I'm just going to go into line. And so a regular polyline, so the regular curve, the control points are basically, if I go into this curve, you can see my control points are not connected to my curve. So I have a little bit less, I just used the word control, but I'll use it again, a little bit less control over what the curve looks like. So if I turn my control points on, meaning making them visible, it's just a little bit less direct. So typically if I'm doing a free form curve, I'm going to go to this section, the second option, which is curve interpolate points. And that allows me to have a lot more control over what that curve looks like because the points are passing through the curve. For this particular curve in the handle, a constant radius will do just fine. So I'll go into arc and look at the different options that I have. So I have start, end, direction, and point, and radius. So I really have a whole bunch of different choices. You kind of have to just kind of experiment with them and see what it looks like. So this one, I kind of control the radius with the angle of that final line there. So that might be a good option. So I'll hit return and that will put me back into that original command. And I'll go a ½ inch in on either side. Maybe I'll go an inch just to be safe. So I can kind of eyeball this and see what feels right. Or I can type in a specific angle that I want. So in this case, I'm just going to kind of eyeball it. And that looks good to me. So now what I have for this particular handle here is I have that closed curve here, plus my arc, plus where it intersects the sides. So right now, there's not much I can do in terms of making this 3D because none of these curves are connected to each other. So what I can do is I can start creating different layers. So if I say this is going to be my handle layer, this is going to be my so I'll just make it all the sides. This will be the bottom. That should probably be enough for now. This will be the slush. And I'll also make sure to save. It's a huge bummer when you've gone pretty far and then suddenly you realize that you haven't saved in ages and the entire program crashes. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a new geometry that just includes the handle with the arc, but not including the through mortises that go through. Actually, no, I'll just include the full length of the handle. So that will be this guy here, and this curve here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the trim command, and it will say select cutting objects. So I want my arc to be a cutting object. Hit return. Select object to trim, I'll hit that rectangle, and then enter when done. So now if you look at my properties, I have two open curves. And open curves, you cannot really create a solid from an open curve. You can only create a surface. So I want to create a solid, so I'm going to select these two curves, and I'm going to join them together. And so you can see now on my properties, this is now a closed curve here. Okay, so I think we've kind of fleshed everything out from the front view. I'm going to double click and go to another view now. And you can see from my perspective that everything is planar, meaning that it's all along a single plane. Now that I am jumping into another viewpoint, there's always the risk that I could accidentally draw in multiple planes, but hopefully I'll continue to go into perspective and sort of double check myself, and if I do draw in multiple planes, there is a command to reverse that. So now I'm going to draw in my right view, and I'm going to draw the profile of the side pieces. So I already have here all of my geometry lined up. And I'll first start, I'm going to hit 0, 0 because I don't want to be clicking way out. I'm going to be in the sides layer. And I know it's probably going to be, let's say, 6 inches wide and 10 inches tall. So to me that looks a little bit awkward, so maybe I'll make it 8 inches wide. And that looks a little bit nicer. I'm going to draw a center line because again it's always going to be easier to draw one half of my geometry and then just mirror the other half over. And then I'm going to decide on the placement of my mortise. So I know that my, if I just draw a line to sort of symbolize my handle, I know that my handle is 2.5 inches. So I need to have a through mortise that's smaller than that 2.5 inches. So what I can do actually is I can split the center line here. So if I say split, objects to split, cutting objects, you can see now this has become its own center line here. So now I should be able to draw a line to indicate where my handle is, and now I can draw a line to indicate the smaller mortise. So let's say that my handle is a 1/2 inch wide. Maybe I can make it a little bit beefier and make it 3/4 inch wide. I'm going to delete that there. So I'm going to actually just draw my handle in space and then place it afterwards. So I'm going to turn off grid snap. Actually, I don't need to turn it off just yet. I'll make it 3/4 inch wide, 2.5. And by touching off on my beginner point, I created a closed curve. Now I can use my move command. And because I had this highlighted, it already knows which object is being moved. I'm going to snap to the midpoint and move it to my center line there. Now I should be able to create my mortise layout. So if this is 3/4 inch wide, maybe I'll make my mortise 3/8. And that way I will have an 1/8 inch shoulder on either side. And then maybe I'll make it 2 inches. So I'm going to just click kind of in the middle of nowhere and say 3 divided by 8 for 3/8, because this command line can do math, which is really useful. I'll use shift as ortho, say 2, 3/8. Cool. And now I should actually be able to use my center snap to place this guy. So I'm going to say move, select objects to move. So snap on my center, and then snap on the midpoint of my line here. So now this guy should be able to just go into my slush, because this just indicates the side of my handle. And so I will hide that there. And this is actually looking too close to the end grain right there. It's going to be creating a lot of short grain. So I'm actually going to move my entire handle downwards. So I'll move it downwards by 1/2 inch, minus 0.5 or minus 1 divided by 2. And I'll do the same with this guy here, minus 0.5. And that looks a lot better, because now I have almost, or exactly 3/4 of an inch of short grain there, which is a lot stronger than the 1/4 of an inch that was there before. Okay, so now going back into my right view, I can start to reuse this line here. So I'll move it out of the way. I'll angle it to 90 degrees, and that can be the width of the top of my tool tote. And I'll select the midpoint and the center line. And then I know from my side pieces that those are going to be 6 inches tall. So 0, 0, 8, 6. So if I delete this all-encompassing rectangle, I have the top of my tool tote here, the dimensions of my side piece, my through mortise here. So now I just need to create some nice lines in between. So one arc that I particularly favor is start and direction, because what I like to do is hit the start, the end, and then just snap into ortho. And that usually just creates a really nice looking curve for me. Feel free for you guys to kind of experiment around and put your own personal twist on it. And then I can mirror that over. Cool. Now I have the side profile, my piece, and these are all open curves right now, so I want to make it one closed curve. So again, I'm going to use that trim command, select my cutting objects, return, object to trim, return, and then you can see when I select on this line, it shows me all that other geometry that I drew on my front viewpoint, but I want this geometry here in the purple. So select that, and then I can actually hold down my shift key. Shift key is basically additive in Rhino, and drag from right to left. So when you drag right to left, everything that you even touch just a little bit gets fully selected. If you drag left to right, only the bits that you specifically select all the way will become selected. And then I'll join those together. And hit save one more time. Okay, so now I'm just gonna go double check to make sure my geometry is all in a good place. Looks pretty good. And now I can start getting ready to make this 3D. Perspective viewpoint is going to be really useful. So I'm going to take all of these highlighted lines and I'm going to actually put them in my default layer. And I'm only going to have solid geometry in my other layers. And kind of keep this as reference points instead. So first thing I could do is I can select this side piece and I can extrude it. So extruding, if you kind of imagine like a Play-Doh noodle maker, extruding is just taking a profile and pushing it in one direction or both directions. So it's in the solid, oh actually no, it's in the surface tab, and I'm going to extrude straight. I'm also going to click on this arrow by perspective and switch it to shaded from wireframe so I can see the geometry I'm making. So you can see right now I'm kind of making this hollow box, and I don't want that because I want a solid object. So I'm going to say solid equals yes. Just click on that in the command. And I want my side to be 1/2 inch thick, so I'm just going to say 0.5 for my extrusion distance and hit return. You can see now I have a solid wall on both sides. And now I should be able to mirror the other side of the toolbox. I'm going to say mirror. And I can just go to my right view and mirror off the center point. So I have the two walls of my toolbox there. And then when I go to select this side here, you'll notice that it does not select my through mortise, which could be kind of problematic if I just want to extrude it all in one go. So what I can do is I can select everything and then I can say group. And what group does is that now every time I click on it, it highlights all of those geometries at once. So if I want to extrude this also 1/2 inch here, make sure that it's solid, and as it learns your patterns, it will start to, if you always extrude solid, it will start to always automatically suggest solid. And again, I'm going to say 0.5 inches. So you can see it extruded it with that through mortise included, so that kind of like reduced the number of steps that I have to go through. And now I should be able to mirror that to the other side using my front. So I'm going into my front view, hitting the midpoint, and creating my other surface. Cool. Okay, so now all that's left is my handle. So I want to get into my handle layer because that's going to be fairly different. And I want it to be centered, so I might actually move the drawing that I've made to the center of my piece. So I know that it's 8 inches, so I can use gumball. And because that arrow is pointing in this direction, and I want it to move in this direction, that means I'm going to have to say -4 instead of just 4. You can see now that it's centered itself in the middle of my tool tote. And now I can again extrude this guy. But this time I'm going to say both sides yes. Solid. And because I'm extruding from the center of my lines instead of just from one side, I have to divide the thickness in half. So I know that my handle is 3/4 of an inch thick, so I want to extrude 3/8 in both directions. And you can see I have my handle. So if I go into perspective, you'll start to see, I'm going to hide my line layer. You'll start to see I'm having some problems because these two surfaces are actually overlapping with each other. So I have a super useful command for that. Basically, anytime you're working with two solid surfaces interacting with each other, you'll want to use a Boolean command. So if I start to type Boolean, you'll see there's a whole bunch. There's Boolean difference, Boolean intersection, Boolean split, Boolean union. In this case, I want Boolean difference because I'm subtracting from one surface. So I'll hit return. I want to subtract from my handle, hit return. Surfaces to subtract with are my sides. And now you can see it's worked correctly. I've created automatic tenons, which is pretty nifty. So I didn't really have to do any work at all. Just a single command for that. And then another problem I'm running into is I have my sides are fully intersecting with each other on the corners. So there's a number of types of joinery that I could use for this. One of the simpler types of joinery that's not really strong in a larger capacity is known as a rabbet joint, and that's what is in the tool tote drawings that I gave you a few weeks ago. So I'm going to go with a rabbet joint just because it's really simple. But that would involve these guys not overlapping quite as much. So this guy is right now overlapping by the full ½ inch. I'm going to say minus 0.25, so minus ¼ inch that way. And you can see now, if I kind of look above, this is what's known as a rabbet, this sort of L-shaped joint. So normally this is not a very strong joint because there's almost never any long grain to long grain glue surface. But in this particular case, because this board is the grain is running horizontally, and on this board the grain will be running vertically, I will actually get some glue surface. And then because it's a pretty small scale project, there's not nearly as much pressure for this joint to be super strong because it's not like a dining room table or a chair or anything like that. So I've moved those out by 1/4 of an inch on both sides, and now I can again use my Boolean difference. So I want to subtract from these sides here to kind of create that little shoulder, and subtract with these sides here. So you can see now I've created a little shelf for those two pieces to interact with. Okay, so I have almost all my geometry. The one thing I'm missing now, which is pretty critical, is my bottom. So for the bottom, I'm gonna go into my top view because I want to actually trap a panel inside my tool tote, so that way there's no chance that bottom will ever fall out, because that's where my heaviest load is going to be on the bottom due to gravity and heavy tools. So I'm going to go into my top view, and I'll turn on my sketch lines again. And in this case, based off of the drawing we sent you guys, the bottom actually has some through dovetails coming along these side pieces here and here. So while the bottom will be captured in a groove along the long side, it will be passing all the way through and interacting as dovetails with the short sides. Okay, so I'm going to delete some of, well, not delete, but hide some of my geometry because it's kind of getting in the way for me. And actually, maybe I'll just go into my bottom layer and get rid of all of my geometry altogether. Okay, so since I already moved these sides a 1/4 inch over where they were originally on the x-axis, that's actually kind of perfect for centering my panel in the bottom, because I'll just start at the origin here. So I'll say 0, 0, and I want it 20 inches long and 8 inches wide. And just to kind of double check, I'll look at my side pieces. And if I select that curve, you'll see that it's trapped in a groove along the long side and it's coming all the way through on the short side. So that's exactly what I wanted. And then I also want some dovetails. So I'll have to make this piece probably at least a 1/2 inch thick to have any sort of substantial strength from those dovetails. So let me just see. I'll hide this guy again. And my dovetails, I want them to be from the side of my piece because I want the strength of the dovetails, the mechanical strength that I get, to be resisting gravity. So I think I might end this video here as is, and then I'll go into dovetails in the next video.